Zimbabwe, for instance. What was the wealth inequality in Zimbabwe between the wealth of Mrs. Mugabe, say, and the average Zimbabwean? The average life expectancy in Zimbabwe during Robert Mugabe's reign halved. He's one of the very few leaders in the world where life expectancy actually declined faster than people were living. People were on a treadmill that was getting shorter and shorter with every step.
Below the UN line for absolute poverty, compared to 40% in Ronald Reagan's time. That's only 40 years. 40 years.
And you go back to that phenomenon that, again, India, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's an extraordinary culture, very, very rich, a wonderful culture, and just the most extraordinary place to visit. But it also has a form of inequality which is grotesque to any Western visitor. I'm talking, of course, about the caste system, which exists to this day, which is a form of slavery as well, and which regards people, if they're born into the wrong class, as being literally untouchable. The untouchable class in India is something you're born into and you will be in for your whole life. Now, is that inequality? Oh, yes. Is it systemic? Hell yes. Is much being done about it? Not really. People take a sort of view that assaulted at such a fundamental and dishonest level that if you were to continue this game, there's just nothing left. Nothing.
Warning, this truth bomb contains enough intellectual dynamite to shatter every comfortable delusion you hold. Murray and Peterson are about to detonate your worldview. Watch these intellectual titans obliterate fashionable lies about Western civilization and expose the suicidal self-hatred destroying our culture. From China's open racism to the West guilt complex, they're ripping away the mask of progressive destruction. They explore how the pursuit of diversity sometimes conflicts with meritocracy and question whether Western values can survive without their religious foundations.
You know, one of my favorite examples, I quote a late colleague of mine's work on this, is racism within China and racism from China about the rest of the world. There's a term that the Chinese use of white people that roughly translates as ghosts. The idea being that, I think it's Hui, and the idea is, of course, is that white people aren't really human. We're like the simulacrum of a human being, but not the real thing. Only the Chinese people are the real thing. Well, that's really racism, for sure. And from the most heavily populated country on earth. And there's no shame.
And one certainly willing to use power.
And one certainly willing to use power. So isn't it an oddity?
So it looks to me, for example, I've tried to make this case that the central animating spirit of the West is something like the spirit of voluntary association, the spirit of voluntary cooperation, uncompelled choice, recognition of universal human dignity. Now, we all fall short of acting that out and instilling it in our institutions, and I see that as a reflection of that deeper theological claim that we discussed earlier, that each individual is in some sense of divine worth intrinsically and should be treated as intrinsically worthwhile as a consequence. And that out of that, as far as I'm concerned, emerges the entire tradition of natural rights, and they're a delineation of the notion of that intrinsic worth. That's not the expression of the will to power. It's the precise opposite of that. And so,
yes.
Why are we so loath to give ourselves credit for the emergence of that idea and our attempts to abide by it? Why are we so prone to guilt in this regard?
Firstly, because
while Western societies examine their colonial history and issue apologies, China openly uses guai, meaning ghosts, devils, as a derogatory term for white people. This reflects institutionalized prejudice from an increasingly influential global power. Meanwhile, anti-Semitism resurfaces under the guise of anti-Zionism, ignoring Jews' 3,000-year presence in Israel, while Hamas's genocidal charter and Iran's threats face limited criticism. The West's self-critique has paradoxically made defending its values controversial.
Firstly, we would go back to that thing that it's regarded as being somewhat gauche and backward and unsophisticated to take such an attitude. And the second is and there are many other reasons, but a second is the completely misinformed idea, and this comes from America in particular, I'm afraid. It's what America has been pumping around the world in recent decades. The idea that what is bad in the West is uniquely bad, and that comes from a complete and wholesale ignorance, not just of history in the rest of the world, but the rest of the world now. I mean, a total, startling lack of context. I mean, if anything ever suffered from context collapse in our era, it is everything to do with the West. So that it is seen as...
There's another element that... There's another element that seems to me to be worthy of note, too. We're tortured for our moral insufficiency because of the existence of demonstrable inequality. And the call for equity is part of the clarion call for the people who are conducting, let's call it, the war on the West. And the proposition there is essentially Marxist, that wealth tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people, which happens to be true, although those people differ. The proportion is small, but the people change. But what's so faulty about that, in my estimation, isn't the claim that that inequality exists, or even the claim that there are negative aspects of that that might need to be addressed, but the notion that that is somehow unique to the social institutions and the economic institutions of the West.
Yes.
I hate that particularly because I think it underestimates the problem. You cannot blame inequality on capitalism.
No,
it's foolish.
Absolutely. I mean, let's take the other option.
The West faces criticism for defending its values, now seen as unsophisticated and backward. America's exported narrative portrays Western flaws as uniquely evil, revealing a startling ignorance of global history and current realities. While wealth inequality exists and deserves attention, it's falsely framed as an exclusively Western or capitalist failing. This mischaracterization actually undermines understanding of a universal human challenge.
On the table, the remaining flotsam and jetsam of the Cold War. Let's say you could say Putin's Russia. You can certainly say Cuba and a few other places. What do we reckon is the inequality of wealth in these countries between, let's say, the oligarchs and the average Russian? There was a documentary Alexander Navalny bravely made before going back to Russia and being imprisoned, and he had it released after he got back to Russia the other month and was promptly imprisoned. He had the release of this documentary called Putin's Palace, and one of the extraordinary things which did a lot of harm for Putin at home, because people were genuinely shocked and upset about this, was that Putin's palace on the Black Sea, which he's been building for years at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, has, among other things, a vineyard attached to it. And there's a guest area, a guest room near the vineyard. And there's a guest lavatory in the guest room, the vineyard. And there's a lavatory brush there made of gold that costs the same as the average Russian makes in a year. So, there's just one example of inequality in Russia. We could do the same thing for Cuba. Let's look at all of the other examples. Look
about North Korea?
Post-colonial. Look at North Korea. I've seen myself in a country which I visited many years ago, but in a country where the general population starved by the millions in the 1990s, and the military elites were able to get hold on the black market of blue label Johnny Walker, one of the most expensive whiskies on the planet. Take any of the, because everyone talks about the post-colonial, I mean, of course, there's post-colonial societies that haven't gone well. There have been post-colonial societies that have gone very well, like Singapore, in terms of productivity. You could say that Hong Kong, until very recently, the same thing. But let's talk about the post-colonial societies that didn't go well.
While the West grapples with wealth inequality, similar or worse disparities exist elsewhere. In Putin's Russia, where Navalny's documentary revealed a palace with a gold toilet brush worth an average Russian's yearly salary. North Korea's military elite enjoyed luxury whiskies while millions starved in the 1990s. This exposes the hypocrisy of singling out Western capitalism, especially when some post-colonial societies like Singapore have thrived.
Zimbabwe, for instance. What was the wealth inequality in Zimbabwe between the wealth of Mrs. Mugabe, say, and the average Zimbabwean? The average life expectancy in Zimbabwe during Robert Mugabe's reign halved. He's one of the very few leaders in the world where life expectancy actually declined faster than people were living. People were on a treadmill that was getting shorter and shorter with every step. Well, what was wealth inequality like there? What's wealth inequality like in Angola these days? I mean, go anywhere. And it is so obscene to present this as you say, as some kind of phenomenon of Western capitalism, as though any other system around could be better.
And to present it as some sort of rigorous theory. So all economic systems produce inequality. It seems to be the reflection of a deep underlying law that we don't understand that well about how advantage tends to accrue as you accrue advantage, and disadvantage tends to accrue as you accrue disadvantage. Positive feedback loops of some sort.
Yes.
All economic systems result in inequality, and different societies have evolved different mechanisms to deal with that. But the only system that we know of that's also produced inequality, but also produced the cessation of absolute privation, are free market systems. And China didn't manage that till they instituted free market systems. And free market systems work because sovereign individuals exercise choice over not only purchase, but also employment. And so people in the West are guilty about inequality.
While criticizing Western inequality, critics ignore far worse disparities elsewhere. In Zimbabwe under Mugabe, life expectancy halved while his wife amassed enormous wealth. Angola's elite and North Korea's leaders enjoy luxuries while their populations suffer extreme poverty. This reveals a universal truth: all economic systems produce inequality through advantage accruing feedback loops. However, only free market systems, despite their flaws, have successfully reduced absolute poverty and provided individual choice.
And liable to rake themselves over the coals when its existence is pointed out, but it's partly because they don't understand how pernicious the problem really is, and they don't take credit for the fact that free markets have stopped people from starving. You know, it's only 8% of people now live below the UN line for absolute poverty, compared to 40% in Ronald Reagan's time. That's only 40 years. 40 years.
And you go back to that phenomenon that, again, I don't think there's any evidence that in modern China, the people involved with the Politburo and the people who've done terribly well out of the last 20 years, particularly since China entered the WTO, I don't think there's any evidence of significant fears about inequality between the Chinese elite and the average person. There is something very specific about the Western worry about inequality, which, again, like the worry about slavery, like the worry about guilt and historical guilt, is a product of a thing that ought to be recognized as being a good part of the machine. If the machine was so pernicious, we wouldn't care about inequality. We would simply say, as I'm afraid...
Or we'd celebrate it even more, which is a perfectly easy thing to do, which is, well, if I have more, it's because I'm better, and the evidence that I'm better is clearly that I have more. And what's your evidence for the contrary claim? Well, people have intrinsic worth. It's like... Yeah.
Right. And you go to another of the world's biggest economies, India. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's an extraordinary culture, very, very rich, a wonderful culture, and just the most extraordinary place to visit. But it also has a form of inequality which is grotesque to any Western visitor. I'm talking, of course, about the caste system, which exists to this day, which is a form of slavery as well, and which regards people, if they're born into the wrong class, as being literally untouchable. The untouchable class in India...
The West's self-flagellation over inequality overlooks two crucial points. First, free markets have dramatically reduced absolute poverty. from 40% in Reagan's era to 8% today. Meanwhile, China's political elite and India's caste system demonstrate far worse disparities without comparable soul-searching. The West's unique guilt about inequality actually reflects its moral progress. If the system were truly pernicious, we wouldn't care about these disparities, or would celebrate them as proof of superiority.
It is something you're born into and you will be in for your whole life. Now, is that inequality? Oh, yes. Is it systemic? Hell yes. Is much being done about it? Not really. People take a sort of view that, well, there's an old joke about Princess Margaret once hearing somebody refer to an extraordinarily grand English country house, and the person says, imagine this coming as just an accident of birth, and Princess Margaret saying, birth is no accident. But actually that view, whether it was correctly attributed to her or not, is regarded by us as being laughable and risible. It's not being regarded as being laughable or at all risible in one of the most important societies in the world today, India.
And historically, that certainly wasn't regarded as laughable in any sense. The notion that you didn't have divine value in some sense, or ultimate value as a consequence of your birth, that was an extraordinarily difficult idea to supplant, uproot, and transform, because that also seemed in some real sense self-evident. And the evidence was your success.
And I'm afraid here we also get to what I regard as being one of the hardest to discuss but most necessary to identify aspects of what I'm trying to tackle in this book, which is what I go straight on to in the first chapter, which is what I regard as being and describe as a now outright war on white people. Now, of course, this is very difficult to talk about because people say, first of all, you're guilty of self-pity of some kind, or boo-hoo, poor you. But as I show, I think in some remorseless detail in that chapter, if you wanted for some reason to attack Africa, or everyone from North Africa downwards, you would at some point, if you were to be driven by such an animus, you would be attacking black people. If you decided to turn on everything to do with Chinese culture, at some point you would be attacking Chinese people. And so it is in the case of the West, that since historically the West has been predominantly populated, not entirely, but predominantly populated by white people, the assault on the West has to include, and now does include, an extraordinarily ugly and increasingly ugly assault on white people, whereby in societies which quite rightly abhor racism, the only group of people against whom racism is completely acceptable has become white people. And this is, to my mind, one of the great unsayables but necessary to address issues of our time, because it seems to me that this can't go on much longer. It's an extraordinarily dangerous game that's being played, and one with such negative consequences, not least the consequences of likely backlash, that it has to be had out in the open.
The Indian caste system exemplifies institutionalized inequality, where untouchables remain permanently confined by birth status, a system that persists with minimal reform. While Western society finds inherited privilege laughable, such birth-determined hierarchies remain acceptable in major global societies. This stark contrast highlights the West's evolved thinking on equality, even as it faces criticism for inequalities far less rigid than those found elsewhere.
At the point at which you are deciding people's futures in the workplace based on whether they're white or not, and that being white means you're marked down, that application to schools and universities involves you being marked down if you're white, that access to medical care, as I give examples of in the book, that you will be deprived of it if you happen to be white in certain jurisdictions. And this, and very much more, is absolute poison in our societies. And I think is one of the things that has to be addressed. If we really don't like racism, we have to tackle the rise of this new racism, which has become totally acceptable and everyday.
to identify Western ideas, let's say, as somehow white, means that you, to the degree that those ideas have a universal value, which might even be the universal value, say, of making the case that slavery is wrong, you have to deny them to other people who aren't of that race, right? You contaminate them irretrievably. I've seen attempts, for example, to make the case that
while Western societies rightfully condemn racism, they've paradoxically made anti-white racism acceptable. This manifests in discriminatory practices affecting education, employment, and even healthcare access. The dangerous trend of marking down whiteness extends to dismissing Western ideas as inherently white, thereby denying their potential universal value, like opposition to slavery. This self-destructive pattern risks serious backlash and undermines genuine anti-racist progress.
The emphasis on logic and excellence is somehow white, and that to accept those values as paramount means that you've just fallen under the sway of a certain kind of racism. And to the degree that that's faulty in its essence, I mean, if a thing is worth doing, then by definition, it's worth doing well. And if nothing is worth doing, then we don't do anything and there's nothing to talk about. And so the notion that excellence is somehow associated with a given race or a racial view is preposterous and demoralizing. And also something that's greatly detrimental, at least in principle, to the very people that are supposed to be helped by such doctrines.
Well, yes, it's possible that the whiteness, the assault on white people, as it were, has become tied up as part of the assault on the Western, let's say the Western legacy. And that what is happening is a desire to enact that revenge I referred to earlier, and a desire to take apart what some of us thought was actually an ideal, which is the ideal that the Western tradition is not actually the preserve of white people, but is a universal inheritance. And I say this repeatedly in the book. This is one way of looking at it, is to say one of the interesting things about so-called, is a phrase I don't like to use, but let's say white culture, Western culture. One of the remarkable things about it has been, yes, in its negative forms, it has attempted to force itself upon people. In its positive forms, it invites anyone who wants to be part of it to share in it, which is, again, not the case with other cultures. There is no way, even in, let's say, in the political systems of any other country.
The current trend of labeling traits like logic and excellence as white is both dangerous and absurd. This framing not only undermines universal human aspirations, but also harms those it claims to help. Western culture's distinctive feature isn't its whiteness, but rather its unique openness. While it has negative historical aspects of forced imposition, its positive form invites universal participation, unlike many other cultures that remain exclusionary.
Outside of the West, if you were to migrate there from a Western country, you would not be able to work your way up to the prime ministership, presidency, or even the cabinet of most other countries in the world, if you were an outsider. The West is specifically in our era, exceptionally open and believes that its own inheritance, its own traditions, its own political order, its institutions, not just should be open, but have to be open to anybody who wants to be a part of them. So that's, and that ideal is one of the ones that in the name of anti-racism is being taken apart in our time. She's saying, no, these things only belong to the white people. And as I say in toward the end of the war on the West, wow are the conclusions that you get to from there negative. I mean, wow are the consequences of that down the road negative, because and as I lay out, as you know, in quite a lengthy passage, there is a response to that just waiting to be said.
So, do you think that the core values of the West are tenable and maintainable in the absence of the underlying religious substrate. So I'm thinking about Jacques Derrida, for example, and Derrida criticized what he called the logocentrism of the West and its emphasis, for example, on binary oppositions. And binary oppositions are the foundation of computation. So maybe criticizing that too deeply is unwise. But in any case, it seems to me that the notion of individual sovereignty is, in some sense, a religious claim. And you can think about the West.
The West's unique characteristic is its openness. Unlike most other cultures, it invites universal participation in its institutions and traditions. An immigrant can potentially become a prime minister in Western nations, something nearly impossible elsewhere. However, current anti-racist rhetoric paradoxically undermines this inclusivity by claiming these values are exclusively white. This dangerous trend risks triggering negative consequences and backlash, while also raising fundamental questions about whether Western values can survive without their underlying religious foundations, particularly regarding individual sovereignty.
And you can think about the West. One stream of Western thought is the Enlightenment, and there's a secular element to that, but it emerged out of a deeper religious tradition that has this universalizing tendency and this universalizing claim. Is it possible then I would say, to what degree is the assault on values that you see and diagnose an assault on religious values? And is it possible to formulate a defense without simultaneously defending some of these underlying religious presumptions?
No, this is the German jurist Bockenforder's dilemma, isn't it? Can you sustain a system that isn't willing to nurture the roots that gave birth to the system? And it's probably the biggest underlying question of our era. The claim has been sometimes yes, of course, and I think that yes, of course has been coming under significant strain in recent years. As I said, I mean, it's not clear that the sanctity of the individual is something that is enforceable purely through human rights doctrine and the court and the international court system.
Yeah, well, it's not self-evident that it's fundamentally a rational claim. It might be instead something more like the precondition for all claims that we regard as rational, which is an axiom rather than a conclusion. And axioms have to be accepted on faith by definition, right? If you define faith as operation within the system that the axioms give rise to. And I've been trying to puzzle this out deeply. There's the idea of the divine individual in the West is associated with the idea of logos, and it's associated with the notion as well that there's something about speech.
The relationship between Western values and their religious foundations raises a critical dilemma. While the Enlightenment brought secular thinking, it emerged from religious traditions that viewed individuals as divine. The concept of individual sovereignty might not be purely rational, but rather an axiom requiring faith, a precondition for rational thought itself. This suggests defending Western values may be inseparable from defending their underlying religious presumptions.
That is fundamentally redemptive, and it's recognition of that, I think, that gives rise to our notion that freedom of speech is a cardinal value, not because it gives you the freedom to speak exactly, but because without that freedom we can't think, we can't improve our institutions,
and we can't get to truth. That it isn't a merely a theoretical exercise. The point of freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, and all these things was to get to a truth. It wasn't a game in itself.
Right.
It was a belief that there was something to uncover at the end of that process that was more than worth discovering.
Right. Well, when I talked to Richard Dawkins recently about such things, and of course, he's arguably the world's most famous atheist, but I like talking to him, and I think Dawkins is possessed by the spirit of the truth to a marked degree. So. And so then one of the things I wonder is, is science itself possible in the absence of the proposition that the truth will set you free? I don't think that's a scientific proposition. Well, I think it's a philosophical or a theological proposition.
I mean, this comes to one of the great jokes against conservatives in recent years. I think I've said this to you in private before, Jordan, but not publicly. But I mean, one of the great jokes against conservatives was that they tended to think that the deconstructionists, for instance, would inevitably stop at the borders of STEM. Remember, for years, people sort of had riffs on the fact that, well, you know, your degree in lesbian dance theory, you know, you just wait till you have to go out into the market and find a job with that useless degree. But these people, actually, the joke was on the conservatives saying that they did all find degrees.
The discussion links freedom of speech to truth-seeking. It's not merely about the right to speak, but about our ability to think, improve institutions, and discover truth. This connects to a deeper question about whether science itself can exist without the religious or philosophical belief that the truth will set you free. The conversation then shifts to critique how conservatives wrongly assumed deconstructionist thinking would spare STEM fields from its influence.
In particular, truthful speech that is fundamentally redemptive, and it's recognition of that, I think, that gives rise to our notion that freedom of speech is a cardinal value, not because it gives you the freedom to speak exactly, but because without that freedom we can't think, we can't improve our institutions,
and we can't get to truth. That it isn't a merely a theoretical exercise. The point of freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, and all these things was to get to a truth. It wasn't a game in itself.
Right.
It was a belief that there was something to uncover at the end of that process that was more than worth discovering.
Right. Well, when I talked to Richard Dawkins recently about such things, and of course, he's arguably the world's most famous atheist, but I like talking to him, and I think Dawkins is possessed by the spirit of the truth to a marked degree. So. And so then one of the things I wonder is science itself possible in the absence of the proposition that the truth will set you free? I don't think that's a scientific proposition. Well, I think it's a philosophical or a theological proposition.
I mean, this comes to one of the great jokes against conservatives in recent years. I think I've said this to you in private before, Jordan, but not publicly. But I mean, one of the great jokes against conservatives was that they tended to think that the deconstructionists, for instance, would inevitably stop at the borders of STEM. Remember, for years, people sort of had riffs on the fact that, well, you know, your degree in lesbian dance theory, you know, you just wait till you have to go out into the market and find a job with that useless degree. But these people, actually, the joke was on the conservatives saying that they did all find jobs. They found them in HR departments, and they told everyone else how to behave for the next generation. And then there was the sort of joke that the conservatives again had of sort of, you know, it'll stop at the borders of STEM because at some point the bridges need to stay up. No, turns out that if you've got a more overriding theory and claim and ambition and drive in your era, if the bridges do fall down, it'll be because of institutional racism and constructional racism and much more, and it'll be because you didn't do it hard enough. It'll be just like the nonsense that everyone said in communism. Look at the stuff of different ways of knowing. I mean, this goes back. I have a deep contempt for Derrida, as I do for all of the deconstructionists, not just because it's so easy to deconstruct and so hard to construct, but because, of course, the deconstructionists always try to deconstruct everything apart from their own university positions. And Derrida and co definitely started some of this, and it's led to this thing we now have. One of the things I describe in the book of the equitable maths nonsense, where we come once again to the anti-white, I would say also anti-black actually, but certainly anti-Western idea that mathematics is a Western construct and that there are other ways of knowing that exist and which must be brought forth. And you don't just get this in maths. And by the way, I mean, as I lay out in remorseless detail in the book, this is being taught in American schools. This is being rolled out in school district after school district in the US. The idea that in maths, in STEM in general, there are other ways of knowing other than the scientific method, accurate mathematics. Things like showing your workings is an example of white supremacy, and on and on and on. And this is completely mainstream today to an extent that I think will shock many readers. These things are effectively in the realm of voodoo.
While conservatives once smugly assumed deconstructionist ideology would crash against the hard reality of STEM fields, after all, bridges need to stay up. We're now witnessing something far more insidious. These theories haven't just infiltrated HR departments, they're actively dismantling the foundations of scientific thinking itself. In American schools, we're seeing the outrageous claim that mathematics, yes, mathematics is merely a Western construct, with basic requirements like showing your work labeled as white supremacy.
Because nobody ever explains what the other ways of knowing are. Let me give you an example. If you don't believe in the mathematical method that actually happens to have been refined in the West, but owes some of its ancestry to a considerable, indeed bewildering array of cultures around the world. Why you can't say, oh, that's interesting, the West may have refined it, but it's got its heritage elsewhere. Hurrah, we're all able to own it. Why instead of that you have to say, no, this is a white supremacist thing, so we're going to come up with other ways of knowing instead of addition and subtraction in the normal way of things. What are the other ways of knowing? What is this voodoo we're being told? Never explained, other than you get this little hint sometimes that it has something to do with better intuitiveness about the concerns of others. And I give examples of this. That basically, you could also argue it's a sort of feminization of certain things, certain realms of study, but essentially that the white supremacist male patriarchal thing is all about the answers and about accuracy and about being on time even. I mean, all of these, to say that they're racist, hardly needs saying. But all of these things are white, and therefore we need to look at these other ways of knowing, which are never explained, but as something which we're all meant to go along with. I mean, to say that this doesn't bear examination is to vastly understate the matter.
Yeah, well, I think the STEM types are completely defenseless against all of this. They tend to be apolitical in their machinations if they're credible scientists and credible researchers, almost by definition, because they're busy obsessively detailing out their specialized concerns and not paying attention to the broader context, which works fine if the broader context is one in which their narrow and specialized productive pursuits are valued, but fatal when that isn't the case. And so one of the questions that we're facing now is...
The critique of other ways of knowing exposes a troubling paradox. While mathematics has roots in various world cultures, instead of celebrating this shared heritage, ideologues label it as white supremacist and propose vague alternatives. These undefined other ways are never properly explained, only hinted at through concepts like better intuitiveness. Meanwhile, STEM professionals focused on their specialized work remain largely defenseless against this ideological assault, their political naivety becoming a liability in today's cultural climate.
What are the invisible ethical preconditions for the successful practice of science itself? And weirdly enough, that's kind of a postmodern question, because the postmodernists did insist to some degree that we exist within stories, although they don't believe in grand unifying narratives, which begs the question for me, then what unites us internally, psychologically, or socially if there's no unifying narrative, if narrative is the fundamental answer? The narrative in which science operates is something like, well, the pursuit of truth is valuable in and of itself, and it's valuable because it's of benefit to people at the individual level. And as long as that's in place, it can all be ignored, and science can act as if it's something unto itself. And I know that's a tricky argument because it does veer in somewhat into the postmodern direction, but we wouldn't pursue science if we didn't think the pursuit was valuable and redemptive.
Yes.
Right.
And was heading towards something. But
yes.
Can you
that
say
can
the
be
same
attained by go ahead.
Can you say the same thing about the humanities? Can you say the same thing about art? Can you say the same thing about metaphysics? Can you say the same thing about politics or economics or anything else? And I think the answer on all of these things is the priority of the era is representation, not attainment of a goal that is worth attaining other than representation. And this is where we get to this.
Here's the fascinating paradox. Science requires certain ethical foundations to function. Yet these foundations aren't scientific themselves. While scientists can operate as if pursuing truth is inherently valuable, this assumption relies on a broader narrative about truth's redemptive value. Ironically, this mirrors postmodern questions about underlying narratives, though today's focus has shifted from truth-seeking to mere representation across humanities, arts, and politics.
Just questions we have to address, which is the game that our societies have decided to play worth playing? And does it mean that we effectively win out in the end or not? And let me flesh that out by saying what I mean is, let's say that across America and all other Western societies, we managed to completely nix the representation game. And the diversity, inclusion, equity game was just solved. And that every board in America and every other Western country, Canada, Britain, you name it, every board had exactly the right representation or over-representation of minority groups, so that there was more trans people on every board, more black people, more minority ethnic people on every board, or exactly the percentage that replicated the percentage in the country. And that every board and every workforce across every imaginable discipline and every industry exactly replicated, of course, as I don't need to tell you the absurdity of this, but that, you had exactly 50% female firefighters and exactly 50% of the police were women. And if in America 13% of the population are black, then 13% of the police are black, and on and on and on. And the same with engineers, and the same with electricians, and the same with absolutely everybody, computer programmers, a lot. Let's say you get to there. Do you beat China? I don't know that the question's at all clear. The answer's at all clear to that question. My own suspicion is actually it's a game that we're playing for politeness reasons and for some justifiable reasons in certain areas. I give the example in the book saying, actually, it makes sense to have, for instance, a police force that...
The question posed cuts to the heart of Western society's current priorities. If we achieved perfect demographic representation across every industry and institution, from corporate boards to firefighters, would this actually help us compete with rivals like China? This representation game, while perhaps politically polite, may be distracting us from more fundamental challenges. The pursuit of perfect demographic ratios might satisfy internal political demands, but doesn't necessarily translate to improved societal capability or competitive advantage.
Represents the community pretty accurately. But do you actually need your, for instance, your basketball teams or your computer programmers all to also completely accurately represent the population? And to have complete representation, it doesn't seem to me that you win any particular game from doing so, other than satisfying the game that the West has decided to play for the time being. But at the end of that game,
well, you win if you regard holding those positions as a reward that's equivalent to privilege, rather than as the opportunity to do something productive in and of itself. Right. And so, because that seems to be part of the conceptualization is, well, your job is a reward to be doled out rather than something that's productive in relationship to valuable ends. And you mentioned the humanities earlier, too. I don't think there is humanities outside of the canon. So science is nested inside an underlying ethic that presumes that, let's say, the universe is understandable, that there's some association between that and logic, that pursuing the truth in relationship to knowledge of the world has this redemptive quality, and that there are very careful ways of doing that. But the humanities is also nested, but even in some sense more self-evidently, inside the idea of a canon. And that canon is traditional. And if you throw out the traditional canon, I think by definition you throw out the humanities.
And well, I mean, as you know, in the chapter on culture, I go into this because I think by this stage it is clear that there is not an aspect of Western culture that has not been assaulted at such a fundamental and dishonest level that if you were to continue this game, there's just nothing left. Nothing. The British Library in 2020 announced that they were...
Western civilization faces systematic dismantling through forced diversity quotas and attacks on cultural heritage. Murray and Jordan expose how merit is being sacrificed for demographic representation, while institutions treat jobs as privileges rather than platforms for excellence. The assault on Western canon, from Shakespeare to Plato, represents cultural suicide masked as progress. This isn't mere change, it's an existential crisis, where self-imposed mediocrity threatens Western civilization's very survival.
Going to create a list of authors whose work was in the British Library, including manuscripts and important documents by these authors, who had some connection to the slave trade or colonialism. And they produced this sort of blacklist of authors, including the late poet laureate Ted Hughes, who died in 1998, who was born in considerable poverty in Yorkshire in the 1930s, who had nothing to do with the British Empire. And the British Library claimed that one of his ancestors in the 17th century had benefited from the slave trade. I mean, this isn't even the sins of the father debate anymore. This is the sins of the ancestor 4 centuries earlier debate. And by the way, it turned out, among other things, that the British Library can't even get researchers these days, because the researchers turned out to have selected a person called Nicholas Ferrer, who actually was opposed to the slave trade and wasn't an ancestor of Ted Hughes. So they weirdly just decided to posthumously defame somebody. And this isn't at all uncommon. The Tate Gallery in London, I give an example, one that I might come on to, which is particularly painful to me, but there's an example of one of the masterpieces they have in there. I don't know if you know the work, but it's a beautiful painting called The Resurrection Cookham by Stanley Spencer, one of the great mid-century British artists. And it's a huge, vast canvas, which the Tate is exceptionally lucky to have, painted in the 1930s, and it is a depiction of the physical resurrection of the dead at the Day of Judgment. And they're all coming out of their tombs in the graveyard of his local church in the village of Cookham. And it's a profoundly moving painting to me. I've always been... I used to occasionally in my lunchtime just go to sit in front of this canvas. Some of the dead coming out of the tombs are recognizably, apparently, neighbors of Spencer's from his village. But he wanted to show the resurrection of all humanity. So he also includes, there were black men and women coming out of some of the graves as well. He didn't have to do that, but he wanted to show the literal representation of the actual physical resurrection. Well, the Tate now has a descriptor beside this sublime painting, saying that it is a racist painting, because whereas Stanley Spencer accurately depicts his neighbours from his village in England, the black people in the painting are generic black people copied from National Geographic magazine of the time. Well, Stanley Spencer didn't have any black neighbours, so what? So what? There weren't any black people in his village in the 1930s in England. And how dare these people, but they've done it now on everything.
Well, they get to be morally superior
Yes.
Western cultural institutions have devolved into self-destructive engines of revisionist hysteria, exemplified by the British Library's absurd attack on Ted Hughes over imaginary ancestral sins and the Tate Gallery's condemnation of Spencer's Resurrection for not featuring enough diversity in 1930s rural England. While ISIS destroys World Heritage sites, our own cultural guardians busy themselves with retroactive character assassinations, poisoning artistic interpretation with ideological warfare. Douglas and Jordan delved into complex issues facing Western civilization, from cultural self-criticism to the challenges of maintaining scientific integrity. What's your take on balancing progress with tradition? How can societies maintain excellence while pursuing inclusivity? Share your thoughts below. If you're interested in more nuanced discussions about society's pressing challenges, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let's continue exploring these crucial debates together.